we have a tilt in the pelvis during pregnancy. As the bump expands, your pelvis is shifted forward. We have different layers in our abdominals, and there's a really deep muscle called the transverse abdominis, and it wraps around your torso. Underneath that six-pack muscle, we've got our obliques, and then under there, we've got this transverse abdominis. That muscle can really help us to stabilize our entire torso. It helps us to stabilize the pelvis. So exercises, a bridge and the bird dog exercise, modified planks, pelvic tilt exercises, which you can do lying on the floor or you can do them standing. Things like that help to work the deep core, really important. And glute exercises like glute kickbacks, the clam with or without a resistance band. Really great to work the glutes, which will help us to re-establish that optimum pelvic position after pregnancy.
Shakira, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you.
Bright and early on moving day for you, so thank you so much for joining.
Bright and early, I know. I was just explaining to you before we jumped on here that my children were away for the night, so I was looking forward to a lion, and then I was like, oh no, I'm up at 7.
The things we do to tell you about women's fitness, guys. So listen up. So, Shakira, I want to start off by asking you about your mission, which is to shatter the stereotype of postnatal fitness and what it means to be a strong mum. Break this down for me. Where did that come from? What does it mean?
So, I think for me, it started and it's evolved and it's grown over the time as Strong Like Mum has evolved into this community. Initially, when I first was pregnant with my first son, I remember everyone was telling me all the things I'd never do again. It was just a real theme of talking to people. It was like, oh, well, enjoy your last sleep. Like, you'll never sleep. You'll never be as active. You'll never have time to yourself. All these things. And I loved, running at the time. And I was like, oh gosh, it feels like people are telling me this is the end of you and you're now just going to be mum. And this is the label of what mum means. And this, you are over here and mum is over here. And then I actually found motherhood to be the exact opposite. Like, of course, our priorities shift and there are changes in our body. I know we'll get to that and we'll cover all of that. But I've never felt more empowered and more connected with who I really am than I have through motherhood. And, initially that started in terms of like my physical fitness. Like, I remember when I ran a personal best on the track after having had my son. And I was like, well, that shattered the stereotype for me of what people were telling me motherhood was. And I found that in all areas of my life. And I'm not sitting here saying, now you're a mum, you're going to do it all, or you've got to do it all, or whatever. But it's just that shattered the stereotype for me is around no one is going to be able to label your motherhood. Whatever you want it to look like, it can work. And you can be a good mum and run a business. You can be a good mum and, have sporting goals. You could be stronger as a mum than you were before. I feel like motherhood, again, when we're looking at sort of physical fitness, we think that, okay, after pregnancy, our body's just going to be, the general narrative is that our body's going to be different. It's going to be broken. It's never going to be the same. And it's not that it's the same, but pregnancy and then postpartum gives us this really rare opportunity where for some women, it's the first time they've ever really considered their core or their pelvic floor. And if we can really focus in on that area and lay the foundations, you could generate more power, more energy than you did before motherhood. So I think that shatter the stereotype is basically just to say there is no one way to do motherhood. No one's going to label it for you. You can create it as you want.
And where do you think this stereotype really comes from? Because as you say, it's quite a negative view of your body's broken, you can't do this anymore, you're going to have the weight that you might have put on from during pregnancy forevermore, and that's you can't do X, Y, and Z. And then you kind of mentioned like you felt empowered, which is quite unusual. Oh, wow. I'm sure it surprised you actually. Hold on, I don't feel broken, because the narrative's so negative. So where does this stereotype come from? Is it some sort of scapegoat of people who don't necessarily want to put the work in or justifying things? Or why is it so negative?
I don't think that's necessarily the case, because I definitely wouldn't go so far as say, some people aren't putting the work in. But I think that for a long time, Well, for a long time, you were encouraged after pregnancy, you know, in terms of physical fitness, not to do anything. You know, we've definitely had the updated research. We know that there isn't enough research in women's health. And then when you know, that's women's health in general. When you then drill down to pre and postnatal or perimenopause or whatever area it is, the amount of research and funding you get is minimal. I mean, nine out of 10 research studies in sports science are still created by men on men. So we didn't have the research. Now we are having more and more experts come to the field that are specialising in women's health. So that certainly helped in terms of physical fitness. But also, you know, as a group, women are speaking out. We're sharing our stories. We're sharing knowledge, and you know, we have this power. You know, social media, the internet. We're getting this sort of global influence from women all over the world that are doing things differently. And again, that plays a part in shattering this stereotype. So I feel like a lot of it comes from history and how women were viewed and how we were told to be quiet and sit still and not speak. And, you know, now we are having women supporting women, and it's breaking down those barriers. Thank the Lord in heaven for that.
And that, as you say, is where social media comes in, and broader media, and you see women running marathons after having a child, or simply going to the gym or going for lots of walks and being active, as you say, when in history that's not happened. That's
Yeah.
been something that is advertised. And maybe if you live somewhere a bit more rural, where there aren't actually that many people and you're not necessarily exposed to that, you can be exposed through social media, through online studies, and seeing people being active, seeing that it is safe, because that safety is a huge worry, because as you say, it's so under research. Dr. Stacey Sims talks about this, how obviously there's not as much research as you say about women, but then when you bring it to women in pregnancy, it's unethical to study women who are pregnant, for many reasons. Therefore, that tiny percentage of women's studies for sport is even smaller. So what actually do they do? And it's such a common thing that women go through, pregnancy,
Yeah.
that it's not actually talked about. It's pretty crazy when you kind of put it in black and white like that
Yeah.
people
I
go
mean,
through it. There's no research.
yeah, well, to be honest, that was one of the things that made me want to specialise in this field, because I was reading an article before I had my first son, so this is now 10 years ago. I love that I had to just think, how old is he? I was like, how long ago was that? I've got a lot of kids, so yeah, it's been a long morning since till 7 a.m. But I remember reading an article, and at that time I was a personal trainer, so I was working in the fitness industry, and it said that only 5.5% of fitness industry professionals were qualified in pre and postnatal exercise. And I was like, what? How is only 5% or 5.5% when the large majority of women will at some point be pre or postnatal? That's a huge failing from the fitness industry for women. And that's when I was like, okay, I want to specialize in that and understand that. And then, I've gone down that route, and exactly as you've said, there's not that much research there, but we do now have a good foundation of research, and I think part of it also comes from lived experience. I've had 4 children myself, and I've worked with so many women. There isn't like one answer for all women, but there is some really great research out there now that we do have that helps us to really work with women on their pelvic floor health, to understand the core better, to understand the female pelvis better. So it is there. It's just it takes some time to learn.
Yeah, exactly. It's so different for everybody, but overall, I guess there are some themes, and obviously there's exceptions from those themes and very, severe cases. But it's interesting to see the overall guest themes and guidelines. And with that, you have the Strong Like Mum movement, and you've got those headings of pre and postnatal health, activity, nutrition, sleep, mindfulness, and hydration. And I just wonder, could we go through each one and actually discuss that, maybe for the pre and postnatal health, how that's different, and actually understanding the changes, because obviously everyone understands the differences, because one point you're growing a baby, the next you've had the baby, but actually what else is going on there? Because a lot of us, what actually happens? And I think that's exactly the core of it, and why we need to speak to experts like yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So those are sort of the pillars of health that I highlight throughout my book. I have a book, it's called The Strong Like Mum Method. I would say now that I worked with other experts in my book. So for example, I am not a nutritionist. So I understand the very base level of nutrition. So I have studied nutrition, and I have my own, again, lived experience, but I am not a nutritionist. So in terms of specifics when it comes to that, that would be a great topic to cover with another expert. I'm definitely more about the physical health and also, my experience with mental well-being. But yeah, I
Let's
think,
go with that.
yeah, I think all of those, 5 pillars that you just mentioned comes into it. Something like sleep, for example, is really underrated. And I mean, gosh, in motherhood, our sleep is all over the place. So in my book, for example, I go through, okay, if you're not getting those hours of sleep that you need in the day, those 8 hours of sleep or 6 hours of sleep that we're trying to achieve in a night, what other options can I have? I talk a lot about, how we can nap. When is the best time in the day to nap so that we don't mess too much with our sleep wake cycle? Because there are specific times that are better. I talk about the fact that there are crucial sleep hours. So between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., though that sort of 4-hour window, are the crucial sleep hours. So if you have a partner at home and you're able to get even a portion of that time to have some solid sleep, that's really going to help you reset for the next day. It's when our stress glands replenish. It's when our melatonin stores reset. So it gives us like a much more health benefits in terms of our immune system, our, body function. So covering aspects of health like that we don't necessarily think about. Obviously, I talk a lot about physical health and exercise, but then alongside that is rest. We need to, prioritize rest. There's some benefits from exercise our body only gets when it's at rest. So there's just so many elements to health. It is not just hit the gym, burn out, and then you're going to see the results. It doesn't work like that.
There's so many different nuances, and I guess breaking down that, okay, sleep, let's acknowledge that if you do have a newborn, you're probably not going to get that much sleep, but there's ways to work around it, and it doesn't make it less important for health, but also there's ways to cope with it. And I think it's just normalizing that, just as you said, in your book. And it's really interesting then to know, the important sleep hours to get, to prioritize that, of when actually you can nap, to not wreck your whole next night's sleep if you have any time to sleep,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. And just zooming in a little bit on exercise, if we can just kind of give some tangible examples, if we go through it one by one. So a woman who is pregnant and is going through a fairly normal pregnancy medically, what actually is the bare minimum that they should do to keep active? What would you say that would be?
Okay, so I would say that walking is firstly, I should start by saying I couldn't say what is the bare minimum, because for some women during pregnancy, if you are experiencing some complications, you might be on bed rest. So
Yeah.
there can be certain complications. But if we're talking about generally
The
a straight,
general avatar of pregnancy,
yeah,
they want to be active, but they don't really know what to do. What's the bare minimum?
okay.
We're not
So
talking about extremities.
So I would say walking is a really great place to start. You want to make sure that you're choosing routes where there's a minimal risk of falling. So, not too much uneven ground, but getting outside, getting walking, getting fresh air into your body, brilliant place to start. And then we know that there are really great benefits to strength training as well during pregnancy. So if that's something you're interested in, starting with body weight exercises. And then there are amendments that we can make as pregnancy progresses. So generally, the first trimester, they say you can continue training as you always have, throughout that first trimester. Some women experience morning sickness. It might not be something that you are able to do. My first trimesters, I was pretty much under the duvet feeling sick the whole time. But if you can, walking, body weight exercises, great. But then I would say in the first trimester, it's not just about what you can do. It is about, well, what's the best thing? So for example, people always ask me, like, can I do a sit up still? The guidelines say, yes, you can do a sit up in the first trimester, but then you have to think about what's really the benefit of a sit up. There's so many better core exercises that we can do for our body that work the whole core. So I wouldn't necessarily prescribe that to somebody.
So what would you prescribe?
Gosh, there's so many other core exercises that I would do. It depends obviously of your level, but something like the bridge, something like the bird dog exercise. We can do a plank, a modified plank on our knees. There's so many other exercises that we can do that can help to work the core that isn't a crunch or a sit up. So that's kind of first trimester. Then we progress through to the second trimester. And as the pregnancy progresses, as your bump grows, and we have this separation of the rectus abdominis muscle, which is the six-pack muscle at the front of your abdominal wall, and it moves out to the side in order for that bump to grow. Then there might be things later on in the second, towards the end of the second, maybe towards the end of the third trimester. Again, it depends on your body and how your bump is developing. But it might be that you find things uncomfortable. You might find it uncomfortable to be on your hands and knees because that pressure on the front of your abdominal wall just feels uncomfortable, in which case we can do things like elevate our arms up onto a bench or a sofa so that we are in that sort of elevated position with that diagonal line. You know, there's so many ways that we can amend exercise, but I would say from a beginner level, walking, body weight exercises, you might choose to work with a resistance band. And then if you are more experienced, dumbbells, and I know you wanted to get to, you know, what kind
If
of
we then
the
have
limit.
this avatar of, okay, really active before pregnancy, what should they do? What's the max they should do in terms of being safe?
So again, what makes working with pre and postnatal women so difficult is that I could not tell you stop here. What I can say is I would avoid any sports, like contact sports, kickboxing, rugby. You know, I wouldn't recommend high contact sports when you're pregnant. Or sports like horse riding where there's a risk of falling. I mean, women do horse riding, but that's not something I would advise if you're pregnant. And then, so my biggest guideline would be both with strength and with cardio exertion, like how hard you're working or how heavy you're lifting. I would say maximum 70%. So in that second trimester, I would say if you're lifting weights overhead, I'd be lifting maximum 70% of what you usually would lift. Same with like energy expenditure for cardio. If you're going for a run or you like to sprint on the track, I'd be working at like a 70% maximum in the second trimester. And then towards the end of the third trimester, I drop that down to 50%. So it's not necessarily, you know, sometimes people say, oh, don't try anything new in pregnancy. I wouldn't say that because for some women, keeping active is completely new. So it's going to be new. But I would say it's not about pushing boundaries. You know, I wouldn't necessarily advise pushing a boundary of your comfort level or really overexerting yourself to try to reach that PB. Those are things that I would say we can build the foundations for that in the postpartum period and achieve that later down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how you say that people can try new things, obviously with precautions put in, because as you said earlier, you know, it might be a period of time where people suddenly are thinking about their pelvic floor, they're thinking about their core for the first time, because suddenly, obviously, you use both of those things in your body every day, but there's a bit more pressure on them. There's a bit more, you know, performance or maybe recovery as we get to the postpartum discussion. But yeah, it's interesting that actually it could be the first time that someone's thinking, hold on, I want to move my body. I want to actually be able to recover from that. I want to optimize this labor if I can do. And they tune in with their body, because that's a completely different discussion to, you're never going to feel like yourself again. You're going to feel so broken, to actually thinking, how can I help my body? How can I help it? Not in a performance optimization way, but just in a necessarily like checking in with how I'm feeling. If I tense my core, do I actually feel my core? Like, what do I feel? You know, if I stand up with my posture, like, are my shoulders back? Like, how do I feel in that way? And just checking in, because then I think that'll really check in mindfully as well and mentally. I've just been like, okay, where am I now? I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do in 10 minutes or 10 days or whatever is going to happen. If, I guess if you're going through pregnancy, what's going to happen in a few months, or all of that kind of spiraling out of whether it's anxiety, excitement, whatever it could be, but just tuning in.
I think you mentioned their posture, and I think that's really important to mention as well. Sorry, when we're looking at minimum exercise or exercises that I would really recommend women do, I would say that, again, if you're new to exercise, you might prefer to work with a trainer that specializes in pre and postnatal, but deep core exercises are also really beneficial during pregnancy that will help us with our postpartum recovery. I would also recommend exercises that work the glutes. So we have a tilt in the pelvis during pregnancy. As the bump expands, your pelvis is sort of shifted forwards. If you can imagine, like a bowl of water, if you tip the milk out the front of the bowl, your pelvis shifts forwards in that way as the bump, it doesn't pull it forwards, but as the bump expands, the pelvis shifts, working the whole core. So without going into too much detail, we have different layers in our abdominals, and there's a really deep muscle called the transverse abdominis, and it wraps around your torso almost like a corset. So underneath that six-pack muscle, we've got our obliques, and then under there, we've got this transverse abdominis, or the TVA. And that muscle can really help us to stabilize our entire torso. It helps us to stabilize the pelvis. It works very closely with the pelvic floor. So exercises, I know I've already mentioned the bridge and the bird dog exercise, modified planks, really great movements, pelvic tilt exercises, which you can do lying on the floor, or you can do them standing if you're further on in pregnancy and lying on your back is uncomfortable. Leg slide exercise, things like that really help to work the deep core, really important. And glute exercises like glute kickbacks, or if you've got a resistance band, doing exercises something like the clam with or without a resistance band, really great to work the glutes, which will help us to re-establish that optimum pelvic position after pregnancy, because it helps us to improve our posture. All of that plays a part in our posture. So you might notice that you have lower back pain in pregnancy because you've got this arch in the lower back where the pelvis has been tilted forwards, and we're compressing the spine at the back. So glute exercises, again, really great to help us, alleviate some of that pressure and reset that pelvic tilt postpartum. So all of that, again, I would say, and I know it sounds like a lot, they're actually very simple exercises that you can do. I'm sharing them. I share regularly simple exercises on my social media, or it's in the book. So those types of exercises really important during and after pregnancy.
And to combat perhaps a myth, perhaps not a myth, are we training during this time as you work with clients? Is it to optimize, if you can optimize, or maybe facilitate labor? Or is it for the postpartum, or a bit of both? But is there some
Both.
sort of help that you can do for labor through training?
Yeah, both. So, again, it depends what type of labor you want. But if you want an active labor, labor's really physical. So having a good cardiovascular system, good heart health, strong muscles, that's going to help you. If you want an active labor where you're maybe gripping onto something and you're hanging down, you might want that. You might want to be on all fours, all of that. So yes, exercise can absolutely help us with labor preparation. A part of labor preparation, what I would say is, as much as we do want to focus on the deep core and working the pelvic floor as well during pregnancy, because again, that shift in the pelvis, if you imagine your pelvis like a bowl, when your pelvis is straight, all your internal organs and everything, they rest equally across the bony structures of the pelvis. So it helps to support all of that weight. When the pelvis is shifted forwards, internal organs, baby, placenta, amniotic fluid, everything is shifted off that bony structure, and it rests more heavily onto the pelvic floor. So that's why we often notice sort of increased pressure or pelvic floor dysfunction, urinary incontinence during pregnancy. So all of that, really important to help us rehabilitate the pelvic floor. But in labor preparation, we also want to work on some pelvic floor relaxation exercises, because we want that relaxation and release to help baby descend down the birth canal. So that is also a part of labor preparation, as is having strength, upper body strength, like I said, if you want an active labor. So yes, exercise can help us prepare for labor, but exercise can also help us to have a more efficient postnatal recovery, postpartum. So both.
The pelvic floor is something that I'd like to touch on a little bit more, because again, even that description you gave of it there, it makes a lot more sense, because we all know that our pelvic floor is important and we should do pelvic floor exercises as we get older, whether we have children or not. It is important to do. But what actually is it?
Okay, so the pelvic floor is a group of muscles. Before human beings were walking up on 2 feet, when we were quadrupeds on 4 feet, the base of the core was the front of the abdominal wall. But then as human beings stood up, we walked on 2 feet, the pelvic floor was created. And it's a relatively small muscle when you look at the rest of the body, but there are lots of muscles that build up the pelvic floor, and it's like a sling from the front to the back, and it's at the base of our core, and it supports everything. Like I just mentioned, our internal organs. It helps us with bladder function, there's so much that our pelvic floor does. Sexual function. So having a healthy pelvic floor is for everybody. Men have a pelvic floor as well. And men also, gosh, this tilt in the pelvis doesn't just happen in pregnancy. If you increase weight, for example, men and women can have that tilt in the pelvis. So it's something that we should all be aware of. You might just have bad posture habits, or maybe you sit for so long and your glutes become inactive. So there can be lots and lots and lots of reasons that we have this shift in the pelvis. So the pelvic floor is really important to help us with everything that I just mentioned. As I said, it helps us with incontinence, it helps us with sexual function, it's supporting all our organs, it helps us to generate power on an exhale when we're doing movements. The pelvic floor is also connected. There's like a deep line of body tissue called the deep front line, and it connects our pelvic floor all the way to our jaw, all the way down through the pelvic floor, and then down to the base of our foot. So there can be so many, if we have pelvic floor dysfunction, or vice versa, it might be that if you are someone who clenches your jaw, or if you experience that postnatally. After having my twins after the cesarean section, my body went into almost like a bit of a shock with the incision site, and I found I was really clenching my jaw. That can mean that it's going to trigger a response to clench and have this like overly tight pelvic floor. Again, foot health, how we stand, impacts the pelvic floor, which is why we might notice incontinence when we're running or jumping. So there's so much that comes into pelvic floor health, and it can also impact all these other areas of our body.
Wow, I've never heard someone actually explain it in such connected terms. The more I learn about our body, it's actually wild how everything's connected. You don't only
Yeah.
have, the gut brain connection, now we have the pelvic floor and the bottom of the feet and the jaw.
Yes.
It's all crazy, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
it's amazing. Yeah.
wow, okay, so there's all of these apps that say, or even, on Instagram, there's accounts you can follow that, stop when you're stop scrolling and do your pelvic floor exercises and we'll do it together and all of this stuff, which might seem lovely at the start, but like what actually is that doing? How often should we be doing pelvic floor exercises? It's important for men and for women.
Yeah.
What's your advice?
So it really does depend on your pelvic floor, health. Where is your pelvic floor at? Do you have pelvic floor dysfunction? Are you noticing some incontinence? Then yes, we want to really focus in on. I think when they're saying do your pelvic floor exercise, they're referring to a Kegel exercise, which is, like I said, this it's a pelvic floor contraction. So some people will say like stop the flow, pretend like you're stopping the flow of urine or something like that. That spaghetti up the bum, whatever analogies people like to give. Yeah. So what's really interesting with that is that this stop the flow of urine, which is like the most common sort of reference, doesn't really get the whole pelvic floor. As I said, the pelvic floor is a sling from the front to the back. Yeah. So the best way, the technical way to make sure that you get that global activation, the whole pelvic floor working, would be to visualize your coccyx bone at the back of your pelvis and the bottom of your spine, and your pubic bone, which is right at the front of your pelvis. And you breathe in and relax, and as you exhale, you visualize your coccyx bone at the back and your pubic bone at the front, drawing in towards each other and then lifting up through the center of the body. So you inhale and release, and as you exhale, you visualize that coccyx bone and pubic bone drawing in and lifting up. And that's going to help us get that like complete activation of the pelvic floor, which is a much deeper sensation than stop the flow of urine. Or the reason people say this spaghetti up the bum is so that you get that other part of the pelvic floor activating as well.
How often should we be doing that?
Right, that's where we started. So let's answer the actual question. I'm so sorry.
I asked to get the spaghetti.
I know. You didn't ask for it. So how many times? Yeah. So it might be, sometimes with clients, I might say, again, because it's partly what's realistic for you. If you could do 5 minutes at the start of the day and 5 minutes at the end of the day, focusing in on those Kegel activation exercises, that could be a great place to start. If you can do it 3 times a day, great. Some people say, look, do it every time you boil the kettle, do your pelvic floor exercises. You can begin there. There can be so many references. It might be, okay, when you stop at a traffic light in the car, do your pelvic floor exercises. That's the general baseline advice. And as I then said, the thing that is difficult with pre and postnatal is there's never one answer. So for some women, and it's often having, needing that pelvic floor strength is the answer that women need. However, I have clients who come to me and they are like, I've done all of my pelvic floor exercises all the time, and maybe they've even bought a pelvic floor trainer and they're squeezing. And they're like, but it's not working. I'm still noticing incontinence issues. So then you look at the broader issue. It could be that you have an overactive pelvic floor. So it is possible to over tighten your pelvic floor. If you do too many of these Kegels, or if you've got pelvic floor training, or like I said, if you've got this jaw tension, signs of a over tight pelvic floor can also lead to incontinence, but you also might notice pain when you insert a tampon, pain during intercourse, clenching of the jaw. If you've got an overactive pelvic floor, if you imagine your pelvic floor like a fist, if my fist is tight, it doesn't work. Like it won't activate anymore when I really need the power. It's kind of stuck. And if you have a partially tight pelvic floor, it can't stop the drip of urine. So you'll notice sort of general leaking that you can't control. And in that case, we then don't need any more Kegels. What we need to do is release and relax the pelvic floor. It might be neither of those two issues. It might be, as I mentioned with that posture issue, that it's actually a posture issue and you've got your pelvic floor is functioning fine, but if you've still got that pelvis, that bowl tilting forwards, and you've got so much extra weight on the pelvic floor that it's struggling for that reason, in which case we want to work the glutes. Activate the glutes will help us to realign the pelvis. We alleviate some pressure off the pelvic floor, and then off we go. So there can be so many reasons as to why you've experienced pelvic floor dysfunction. But to answer the actual question you asked, 2 to 3 times a day. I could have summarised. That's all you needed, isn't it?
I feel like if you just answer my question straight off, though, it'd be quite a short podcast. Keep elaborating. So should everybody tune into this? Is it men, women in their 20s, 30s, not just when they're pregnant, just had a baby? Is it important for everybody?
It is important for everybody. What I would say is that potentially we will notice that our pelvic floor is affected as we age. So our pelvic floor function. So working the pelvic floor does become something that we maybe need to focus on more as we get older in order to help support our pelvic floor. That's partly to do with hormone changes, our estrogen, the muscle tone, the muscle tissue that we lay down. It can also be, as we've just mentioned, it could be related to posture. There could be so many things. Yeah. Pregnancy can obviously impact the pelvic floor, but it is for everybody. What I would say is that, I mentioned this 2 to 3 times a day. My pelvic floor, when I first had my children, I was working on all my pelvic floor deep core exercises. We want the pelvic floor to be working in our general day-to-day life. So if I go for a jog or if I'm at the gym, I'll make sure that I'm activating the whole core, because the pelvic floor doesn't just work on its own. So it's, initially we might be focusing in on the pelvic floor, but then what we really want is our abdominal muscles, our pelvic floor, our back muscles, our glutes, everything to be supporting and working in synergy, to be working with balance. So it's not just about the pelvic floor. So I don't wake up now and 2 to 3 times a day do my Kegel exercises, because my pelvic floor functions in all the other exercises that I do. And that's really where we want to get to. So you might not need or have the time to do it 2 to 3 times a day. You might do it once a day. You might do it 3 times a week. You might be, off on your merry way doing all the exercises that you enjoy. So there's no sort of like one size fits all, but yes, pelvic floor health is for everybody. Generally, when we're younger, we're kids, teenagers in our 20s, we're not really thinking about our pelvic floor, and the pelvic floor is still functioning fine. Maybe towards the end of our 20s, if we start to adopt weird posture habits or we're sitting into our hip, we might begin to really notice it.
Wow, that's just really opened up the conversation. Yeah, I think that's really applicable for everybody. So yeah, super interesting. And zooming back in then, we kind of covered the pregnancy part of exercise and what is realistic and minimum and maybe what we could optimize with. And then if we go postpartum, someone comes to you, they've just had a baby. What do you look at when maybe creating a fitness plan for them? What are the signs that, obviously everybody's different, so if we kind of go broad scale of an uncomplicated situation, What do you look at? What should they be thinking?
So the pelvic floor is the first thing that we would look at to see how it's functioning. It's the first sort of assessment I would run, and then posture. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but both those two things are the things that I'd be looking at. Initially, I'd be looking at your pelvic floor health, and then I'd be looking at your posture. And then I'd be looking at how how does your pelvic floor or how does your core respond when you're doing other movements? So, for example, for example, with incontinence, if we're looking at incontinence, there can be a difference between experiencing incontinence when you are jumping and running to incontinence when you are coughing and sneezing. So I'd be looking at when you notice that incontinence, that could maybe indicate, what we're experiencing. And then I'd be looking at, like I said, getting the core to work together in synergy. If you like, your core is like a sofa. You know that Friends episode? Have you watched Friends?
Yeah,
You're too
yeah.
young for Friends. Okay.
And no, I've watched it. Don't worry, it's on Netflix.
For you. So when they're lifting that sofa and they're like, pivot. So the core is like lifting a sofa. If you've got a group of friends and you're all lifting a sofa up, if one friend is a little weaker than the other, it's imbalanced. You can't actually like lift the sofa and get it to where you need to. So the core works in a similar way. We could have a great pelvic floor function, but if the glutes aren't working or the pelvis is tilted or our respiratory system, so the way that we breathe, getting that like coordination with our breathing, huge part of our core function, then the sofa's going to be tilted. And, you might notice pelvic floor, repercussions in the pelvic floor from all those things. So getting the whole core to work together. And then it's about building strength and endurance, cardiovascular fitness, and building it up slowly. So we don't need to rush straight into doing a HIIT class, but building it up slowly so that our body, I'm really interested in movements that help us to manage our day-to-day life easier. So what does this mother need that I'm working with? Lifting children, maybe they've got more than one child. It's lifting children. It's having the cardiovascular energy to run around the park with your kid. It's, you might need to lift something heavy off the top shelf and bring it down. It's bending, it's standing. So all those functional exercises that help us lead a healthy life. And then if you've got other sporting goals, once we've got all of that in place, then it's looking at getting you back to the place that you want to be, the sport that you enjoy.
Amazing. So you kind of have that overview of, I guess it's like a health check, really, isn't it? The fundamental parts of core, posture, and pelvic floor, which all sound rather complicated, and I think very, varied, really, in how people can have that situation. Even when are you feeling? Like, is it when you sneeze, or is it when you run or walk or anything like that? Would you recommend working with a fitness professional who specializes in that? Is that something that for women who want to go back to sport, is that something that you actually think is really, really important to kind of understand it, because it is so varied?
Yeah, I think if that's something that if it's something that is new to you and you are unsure about what you should be doing, then yes, if you have the time, if you have the finances to be able to afford that, then yes, absolutely. I would say looking for the credible sources, on social media, there are people out there, but half the people don't really have the expertise. They're just spouting general advice that they've read or Googled or whatever it is. So I would say find that credible support. And I would say that it's difficult because, yes, gosh, if everybody could have a personal trainer, that would be great, but it's just hugely expensive. So you might not be able to do that. There is so much that we can do ourselves. There is so much that we can do ourselves. But if you are uncertain, maybe check with your midwife, check with your GP. It's difficult because midwives and GPs, again, they're not specialists in the field of pre and postnatal exercise or rehabilitation. So
And
find me.
I'd say that there's quite limited research, and there's been more, but even the NHS experts are obviously going to specialize in the medical side of
Yeah.
things. Therefore, the physical side, perhaps there's a bit less specialization, which is then, I guess, when, if you can't, for whatever reason, work with a personal trainer who specializes in it, there'll be many reasons that people will choose not to. There are so many resources online. Going back to social media, like you yourself have so much online on your Instagram alone that can help women, that can help just advise, or resources like this. I guess
Yeah.
the whole point of having these conversations
Yeah.
are me asking lots of questions of things I don't know, and hopefully other people don't know it as well, and opening up the conversation with experts like yourself.
Absolutely. And then you've got the NHS, you've got the Mayo Clinic, credible research studies and the latest information that will have sort of general advice. And I would say, like, in that kind of situation, if you're not working with a personal trainer, if you've spoken to your midwife, you've spoken to your GP, you've been cleared to exercise, you're looking for credible sources, yes, but also then, there are some red flags. If you are pregnant or postpartum and you're doing exercises, number one, build up slowly, as I've said, pelvic floor posture. Then I would slowly begin to phase in or phase out impact. So in pregnancy, for example, impact exercise is fine, but as we progress through the trimesters, I would minimize the impact exercises that you're doing and go for low impact and eventually no impact exercise. And then in the reverse, postpartum. So you might want to start with no impact or start with low impact and then increase the impact of an exercise. So something where you're, stepping, jumping, running, bringing that impact exercises in slowly as the intensity increases. And then if you notice any red flags, for example, any unusual bleeding, any pain, any bulging or heaviness around the pelvic floor, if anything is causing, if you're doing an exercise and you're noticing an increased lower back pain, for example, I'd modify the movement and scale it back, doing an easier version of that movement. But like you said, there is credible information out there. I would just say slowly building up in the postpartum period is really important.
And you mentioned towards the start of our conversation about the mental well-being side and how that can link to the physical side. And as we know, we know that the gut is linked to the brain. We know that the pelvic floor is linked to the feet and to the jaw. And we also know that the physical side of well-being is linked to our mental side of well-being.
Yeah.
And kind of talking more broadly, not necessarily just people who are, pregnant or postpartum, women in general that you work with. What is the view on mental well-being? How do you tune into this in connection with being, a personal trainer in that sense?
So, gosh, the mental health side of it is just so important, especially to me. I have my own experience with mental health. So I had extreme prenatal and postnatal anxiety that manifested in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. It was really quite severe. I mean, when I had OCD comes in many forms. I had tapping and counting. So I would feel like I would need to tap in this space 5 times or step over a crack in the road. That was sort of how my OCD manifested. At my worst, it was taking me 4 hours every night to get to bed. It was just really extreme. And exercise was a huge part of my recovery. I mean, we hear all the time about how exercise can help our endorphins or, even something like breathing. When we take a deep inhale, when we allow our diaphragm to descend, our diaphragm, as it drops down, it massages the top of our intestines, and that stimulates the production of a hormone called serotonin. And serotonin is released in the brain, but the production is stimulated in the gut. So as our diaphragm descends with each inhale and exhale, it massages the top of our intestines and it stimulates serotonin, which helps to improve our mood. So even just deep breathing, really brilliant for helping us lower anxiety, lowering stress levels. Exercise again, serotonin, endorphins, brilliant. But then on another level, it can also help us, for me, like when you are anxious or stressed or overwhelmed, the rate of the thoughts that are going through your head, for me anyway, it was constant narrative, And again, I think parenting, motherhood can sometimes be like that. You're thinking of all the things you've got to do. You become programmed to have to think of so many things. I've got 4 children and I'm always thinking where they need to be. What have they got to do? Have I packed that bag? Have they got their lunchbox? What are they having for breakfast? Constant. And then I'm thinking of work and it's constant narrative and it gets stressful. It's so busy. And when I had my high anxiety, initially I did hypnotherapy, and hypnotherapy just allowed me to slow that speed of thoughts enough that I was able to actually process them rather than feel overwhelmed by them. And exercise gives me the same thing. If my children are sick, it is one of my big triggers. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, do they need Cabell? Do they need the inhaler? Do they need blah, 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 blah? I've got to take them to the doctor. Do I need to go to A&E? Blah, 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 blah. If I can just go for a walk or a jog or within 20 minutes, I'm able just to process, thinking more rationally, thinking more clearly. And so exercise can really help us in that respect. The connection between the body and mind is absolutely massive on a hormonal level, on an instinct level. There's so much. So yes, absolutely, the connection is strong. And to be honest, I think exercise and movement saved me from my own negative mental health experience.
Your example there of, even if you went for a walk and you were just able to process things a bit, it's as though you kind of pause that spiraling of all the thoughts because you're distracted by exercise. You're thinking, okay, I'm looking outside at the nature around me and I'm out my walk, or I'm going for a run and I'm focusing on my breathing, or I'm, cycling and I'm, trying not to hit a car, and all of these things. And it's just that distraction that actually allows your thoughts to catch up with your present moment and you to process it. It's quite funny how our brains are so complex yet often so simple. If you give your brain 10 minutes of driving somewhere with no music on or no podcast on or anything, suddenly you've processed so much and you can kind of catch up with yourself. And then suddenly you might have a creative idea because you actually have the capacity to, because you're not filled with what did that they mean when they said in that meeting, and then what did this mean, and what am I going to have for dinner, and then what am I going to do, where should I go on holiday, I just can't decide, oh, I need to book this and I've forgotten to do that. But actually you think, oh well, actually that'd be a really good idea, and maybe I should write that down, or hold on, like what happens maybe, in your own specialization, you might have a really good like business idea, or something might just click, or a conversation you've had with a client, maybe you're like, oh, hold on, that's a really good point, I should research that a bit more, and you
Yeah,
can just catch up with it. And that's, I think, where we can feel a bit more like ourselves, because that's
yeah,
how our brain will work authentically when we're not filling it with crap, really,
yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's just information or worries or just constant consumption of things, of media. I
Yeah.
think that it actually shows us who we can be. And maybe, I mean, really, I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but like maybe it can feel, when you are a mum, because there's so much going on, and especially maybe if it's new to you or you have a few children, then there's so much information, there's so much stuff that we don't really have the capacity to think with our own thoughts and maybe how our brain would authentically be, which is that disconnection of who you viewed yourself as being.
Yeah, well, and as a mum, I often found people would tell me, trust your instincts. For example, if my children were sick and I'd take them to the doctor, they'd be like, they're fine, but you're the mum, so trust your instincts and bring them back. Well, if you're stressed or you have anxiety, it is very difficult to tell what is the difference between a stressed thought or an anxious thought and an instinct. It's
Mhm.
I couldn't tell, and I was like, yeah, but I'm worried and I'm stressed and when you do that, and like I said, it slows the rates of thoughts, I was able to then distinguish between what's my instinct telling me and what is anxiety driven. And then I was able to sort of dismiss the anxiety and focus on the instinct. So yeah, absolutely. It helps us with clarity of thought.
And to kind of close off this conversation where we've covered a lot, what would be the main points that you'd want someone to take away? What are the summary points that you think are most important in the work that you do with women in fitness? What would you like them to kind of take away from this conversation?
It really would be that shatter the stereotype, that I think, and I mean that in a few ways, but firstly, when it comes to physical fitness and physical recovery, there will be an answer for you. If, like I said, with the pelvic floor, it could be your pelvic floor's tight, could be your pelvic floor's weak. It can feel overwhelming because there are just so many options. Every woman, every pregnancy, every postpartum experience is unique. There will be an answer for you. So, you never feel that hopelessness of okay, I'm just going to have to live this way. There will be an answer for you. It just takes, exploring what it is that your body specifically needs. But also, that I found it really empowering, maybe daunting, but really empowering to know that there is no one way to be a mother. There's no one way to be a good mother. And you can feel empowered in yourself as a woman and be a fantastic mother. I think that can allow women this incredible freedom and power to be able to create their lifestyle the way that works for them, not the way that society tells you you've got to be or what you've got to do or how it's going to pan out. You really can curate a motherhood that works for you. And I think that's really important. And that would be like my key takeaways that I would love women to get from this conversation would be that there is going to be an answer out there for them. So keep looking for your answer, keep, pushing to get the answers that you need. And also to know that your possibilities are limitless. Having children is fantastic. And yes, absolutely, our priorities shift. And there are times when I don't do something because my role as a mum is where I'm needed the most. But we can absolutely do, our opportunities are limitless. We are not labeled into one way of being a mum. We can be whatever type of mum we want.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that word that you used at the beginning was empowerment. You felt empowered.
Yeah.
And that again can be in any way, in whatever type of mum or woman or anything that you want to be. I think it can go back to that, and fitness is part of that empowering. It's not some horrible rule that we need to apply to our lives or anything like that. It is something that will help us enhance our life, that we can improve all of these vital parts of our body, strengthen them, help us go through it all. And it is that empowering. It's not a punishment.
Well, and also those moments where and that's not to say that we don't have moments where we feel weak or overwhelmed or stressed, or, I mean, motherhood I have experienced some of my greatest challenges, my deepest depths, and with my mental health, or even with my physical recovery after I had my twins via a cesarean. And again, I remember feeling completely disconnected to my body. I couldn't bend down. I couldn't lift my leg up. It's not to say that we don't encounter challenges or, days where we feel stressed, overwhelmed. But I also have experienced through those times, for me, overcoming the mental health struggles that I overcame gave me this incredible resilience. And I felt, again, through that, I actually felt empowered, because I was like, if I can get through that, I have the best work ethic since being a mum. I work so hard. You know what it is to pour from an empty cup. And I'm not saying that we should be pouring from an empty cup. We need to make sure we refill our cup. But I now feel empowered to take time to myself if I need it. Or sometimes I've got nothing left in the tank and I'm still having to give it to my children because that's what they need. So I've experienced new depths of emotions that I never knew existed. But as the way I've pulled it all together in my mind and my understanding is actually like, I've never lived a more vibrant life. I've experienced, as I said, emotions to new ranges. I've experienced, So to me, that limitless, possibilities of life experiences.
Yeah, no, I love that description of it. And the highs and the lows, as you said there, it's proof of, well, I was actually able to pull myself out of this, and I was actually able to do this. And it's just that, not in like a cocky way, but in a confidence way of who you want to be. And when things go wrong again, or, you face more challenges, you have that proof and confidence that you can kind of pull yourself through. So yeah, super, super interesting stuff. And Shakira, if people want to work with you, follow you online, see some of these resources that you have, where should they go?
Yes, so you can find me at stronglikemum.com. You can download the Strong Like Mum app, which we are recording today. It launches in a week, so I'm assuming that it will be live by that time, which is an app that I have, which again, I mean, so it covers physical recovery, physical fitness, and everything from pre and postnatal through to peri and postmenopause. But I also have a knowledge hub on the app, where it covers mental well-being. We look specifically at understanding the pelvic floor. We've got breath work, motivation hub. So there's nutrition on the app, again, specifically pre and postnatal nutrition, strength training, nutrition. So there's a whole host of knowledge that I would love to share with women there. And then I have my book, which is called The Strong Like Mum Method. And that is available online, on Amazon, in bookstores. And again, it takes you from pre and postnatal, and that book is about instinct, knowledge, and exercise. So I share lots of things we've just covered, more including those pillars: sleep, nutrition, exercise.
Wonderful. I'll link those below so people can
Oh,
check
and
them
on
out.
Instagram. I don't know if I mentioned that. It's usually the first.
I know, right?
You can find me on Instagram at Shakira.Akabusi, or if you search Strong Like Mum, then I'll come up then as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shakira. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me.